Welcome to the panel discussion organized by the Institute for Security and Technology. We are a critical action think tank uniting technology and policy leaders to create actionable solutions to emerging security challenges. I am Mariam Bizrashalashvili, and I'm leading IST's AI Risk Reduction Initiative, where we unite AI ecosystem stakeholders to research various AI risk categories connected to frontier AI and try to come up with the appropriate solutions. Today, we will explore how exactly AI fuels cognitive warfare, and more importantly, how can we fight back? IST began exploring issues on the intersection of AI and national security pre-ChatGPT era. So before the generative AI took over the global attention and captured the global attention, we worked on various initiatives stemming from implications of AI integration in nuclear command control and communications, and also how AI shapes offense-defense balance in cybersecurity. Last year, we published a comprehensive report on the malicious use of AI, where we explored how AI is shaping and reshaping state conflict and the methods by which malign actors undermine social cohesion, including by AI-enhanced active measures. But of course, we don't only want to admire the problem, we want to be part of the solution. And we want to talk about how do we build resilience against cognitive warfare, and perhaps if AI can be part of the solution. So with that, let me introduce our panel moderator, brilliant Gabrielle Tran. Gabby is a senior analyst for technology and society at IST and the author of our recent report on generative AI's impact on cognition, society, and the future.
Thank you. Thanks for that great introduction, Mariami. Thank you all for attending our session today. Before we get into discussion, before I introduce our amazing panelists, I want to give you all a roadmap for our conversation. So we're going to start off with the foundation, so what it means to study and target human cognition, and of course, how our adversaries are increasingly strategically viewing the cognitive domain, especially in the context of AI. And then from there, we'll shift to how AI is and is not changing influence operations, drawing on field and industry insights, and importantly, as Mariami highlighted, what we can do about it, how defenders can respond. And we'll be ending with a quick 15-minute audience Q&A. So if there are any threads you'd like to pull on, you can keep that in mind for later in the conversation. But without further ado, joining us today, we have Nathan Beauchamp-Mustafaga, Senior Policy Researcher at RAND, focusing on Asian security issues. We have Jessica Brandt, Senior Fellow for Technology and National Security at the Council on Foreign Relations. We have Dr. James Giordano, Director for Center for Disruptive Technology and Future Warfare at National Defense University. And finally, Ben Nimmo, Principal Investigator on the Intelligence and Investigations team at OpenAI, who I recently learned was declared dead in 2017 by 13,000 Twitter bots. So thank you for joining us today, back from the dead. Welcome back.
You look great. Great to be alive again.
Amazing, amazing. Okay, so let's just start off. Nathan and James, I'm gonna start with you to give us the kind of strategic overview of the cognitive domain, even before AI kind of became the hot topic. So maybe James, to set the scene for us from a neuroscience perspective, what does it mean, as you said previously, that the human brain is now a battlefield?
Yeah, it's a good question. So obviously the focus of this panel is the intersection between AI and cognitive warfare. So I'll start with a very, very simple question for the audience, and they can define the battlescape. If cognition is one of the functions of mind, where does your mind live? Point to it. Do it. Where? That's the battlescape. Exactly right. The older adage in so much of influence deterrence and even direct military operations was trying to win hearts and minds. It was working from the bottom up, affecting the body so as to be able to deter, influence, defend against those who contend against you. And now it's a little bit different. Now the idea is if we can work through the cognitive domain, through narratives, semiotics, iconographies. And we can do that in a variety of different ways, beginning in the non-kinetic space and perhaps moving to the kinetic space, or engaging the kinetic space in ways that are bodily, but not necessarily bellicose. Well, now that creates an entirely different battlescape, if you will, not just the battle space, the entirety of the scape, its focus, its scope, its tenor. It's not that the nature of warfare per se is changing, its character is changing. Its character exists in the cognitive domain. So if we were to envision what cognitive warfare entails and obtains, what I'd like you to think about for the remainder of this panel, specifically for AI, is that it really is a biopsychosocial engagement. We can affect the cognitive domain directly via the neurobiological substrate, the embodied brain, in whoever that is that represents the target or the focus of our engagement, point number one. But let's face it, nobody exists in a vacuum at all. I mean, literally, from cradle to crypt, from birth to grave, we're embedded, we're nested in our environments and those ecologies. And in that way, we have to situate the embodied brain in that individual within some environment, within some ecology, within some collective that is dynamic and multidimensional. How does this individual relate to that ecology, to that environment, to those others? Through our cognitions, inclusive of our emotions, through what we receive, through what we process, perceive, and emote and express. And that is the psychological realm. So if you think of the cognitive battlescape as a scape of engagement, it can certainly exist on the biological realm. You're all biological organisms. We exist within that social milieu, and we engage that social milieu receptively and expressively psychologically. So targeting those substrates, understanding what it is, how various brain structures in individuals and in collectives of individuals may be able to be involved in, mediate, subserve certain functions of those individuals in collectives, in groups, in a variety of circumstances and situations, allows us to essentially reconnoiter the brain to be able to target key brain substrates that are the functions of brain, mind, that are expressed in a receptive and outgoing way, in a deliverable way, to be the cognitive space. This represents the new battlescape by virtue of information, influence, definition of what represents truth and veridicality, and how individuals respond to that. We respond to what we sense, we perceive what we sense, and we base that upon our prior biases. And if we can influence those things in ways that direct the emotions, cognitions, and behaviors of others, it's weaponized. Oxford Dictionary of a weapon is not necessarily something that goes bang, boom, but means of contending against others so as to change their thoughts and behaviors to your own will.
And that framing really kind of brings home why it's not just about information security, but cognitive security, as you're saying. And Nathan, maybe building on that, in your research, how are you finding nation-state actors kind of prioritizing the things James just elaborated on?
Yeah, I think that's a great starting point. So I can talk to China and how at least some in the Chinese military might think about this. So, the Chinese military is part of the PRC, run by the Chinese Communist Party. And so in many ways, the CCP, since its founding, has always been about hearts and minds, right? As a revolutionary party, as a governing party, they have always focused on hearts and minds. Now, you may say, well, I know a little bit about Chinese history. They don't seem to always be very good at that. That is true, but that doesn't mean that they aren't thinking about it, right? And they don't value, prioritize winning, or at least competing in and seeking to win the narrative contest, right? And historically, a lot of their focus has been domestically. You could say that CCP's number one influence target is domestically the Chinese people, right? They want to stay in power, and they have to do that by convincing the Chinese people that they're not so bad after all, that they're delivering some goods, whether economic or social goods, and that, it's okay, we'll just get by, right? And so that has been kind of the broader, CCP focus. But speaking directly to the Chinese military part, they historically have not spoken a whole lot about the cognitive domain, right? If you're familiar with anything about Chinese military influence operations, the kind of overriding concept in circa 2000 into the 2010s was the three warfares, right? Psychological warfare, public opinion warfare, legal warfare. So obviously here, public opinion warfare would kind of incorporate, speak to a lot of these themes that Jim was already talking about. But what we've seen is actually a shift in at least some of the discourse within the Chinese military. And specifically here, I'm talking about advocates of a new operational concept called cognitive domain operations. So already from this name, what you can tell is that there is an idea of the cognitive domain. And so if you actually trace back where this conversation in the Chinese military starts, it is really a continuation of pre-existing concerns about cultural security, ideological security, which really is another way to say regime security and information security. But specifically, this idea of the cognitive domain and cognitive security comes around early 2010s as a response to their observations of the Arab Spring, protests in Iran, that were fundamentally driven by social media as a foreign, Western, US controlled, driven phenomenon that was very much, especially both abroad and within China, for specific high profile incidents that were driven on their early version of Twitter, Weibo, that were outside of regime control. It really drove home to them that information was, again, slipping away, and they had to respond. They had to compete in a new domain, right? And so this drove a lot of fears of regime security. You see good examples of both Hu Jintao and when Xi Jinping came to power, a key focus on information space as a core competitive part of CCP governance. And so for the PLA, they started talking about cognitive security, and then that, I think, led to at least a part realization that traditionally in the military domain, they would have focused, like the US, on land, sea, air. Maybe in the 90s you would add space and cyber. But at least some of the Chinese military now, if you went and talked to them, would argue there should be a fundamental reconceptualization of what the battle space is. They would argue that it's now the physical space, the information space, and the cognitive space. And that all of those domains I previously talked about really fit into mostly the physical space. And so if you're familiar with a little bit of Chinese military strategy, they talk about system of systems destruction and system of systems warfare. And so they would actually argue that the kinetic activities should be targeted not at total warfare and total destruction, but for seeking a limited conflict, it's fundamentally a psychological act, psychological capitulation, surrender, right? Short of total destruction. And so that means that it's a psychological cognitive decision. And that means that the goal of operations, whether non-kinetic or kinetic, should be tailored, in this view, at generating specific cognitive effects. And so there has been this realization of a new domain. And in Chinese military theory, any new domain inherently has, and thus must be discovered, operational concepts and theories. And so cognitive domain operations is one of those kind of prominent operational concepts that some in the Chinese military talk about. And how it relates here is that one, it's very clearly been in some Chinese military writings directly associated with activities on social media disinformation. We have that from very high quality sources. And second, that a lot of this is also driven by this kind of PLA focus on technology. And so when they think about AI, they think about this as a revolutionary approach, not just to cognitive domain operations, which yes, definitely is, and we can talk about that, but more broadly is getting into intelligentization, right? The idea that information, data is not just ever present, but with computing power, big data, you're able to actually fundamentally change the nature of your operations. And so this is infusing every part of Chinese military's thinking, and it's carrying over here to cognitive domain operations.
Perfect. And I think that's the kind of perfect segue from the strategic value of cognition to maybe what's happening actually on the ground. So maybe Jessica, we can start with you and then we can go to Ben. So in your experience, how are these actors actually using the AI to kind of refine and scale some of the influence operations?
Well, first, thanks so much for having me. It's nice to be with all of you. Maybe just like three big trends to kind of set the context. The first is that there are just a greater number of more diverse actors getting into this space, perhaps state and non-state. I think, sort of perhaps driven by the sense that this kind of activity is normalized. The second is the rise of these commercial firms that conduct influence for hire. This is important because it complicates attribution. It makes it much more difficult to sort of figure out who is the initial instigator of the activity, which, especially when you're in the intelligence community, which is where I most recently come from, that matters a great deal. And it also is obviously intersects with that first trend because it, is resourcing. additional actors to get into the game and to conduct ever more sophisticated operations. And then the third is obviously, the rise of relevant emerging technologies. Big data analytics is one of them, AI that again are, complicating attribution and increasing the number and the sophistication of these kinds of operations. I mean, generally what I would say and what, I think the IC has said is like this kind of, AI has sort of, it's a malign influence accelerant, but it has not wholly revolutionized, these kinds of operations. So, I guess what does it mean in practice? We've seen all of Russia, China, Iran have all used AI in their influence operations. In the 2024 cycle, Russia was, by far the most prolific actor generally, and in its use of AI. We saw that across, all four mediums, audio, video, images, text. And they used AI for things like, to create media of and about prominent U.S. figures, and also to amplify sort of divisive social issues, things like immigration, et cetera, consistent with their longstanding goals. Iran, we saw them, use AI to generate news articles that they, put on sort of websites that purported to be authentic news sites. They were not. And for other uses. I think interestingly, this content was in English and in Spanish. It targeted audiences across, both sides of the political spectrum. So that's sort of the Iran picture. China has used AI in its influence operations, but these were sort of broader operations, more targeted at sort of shaping views of China globally, and of course amplifying, divisions in the United States. Not really operations, specifically targeting like an election outcome. So we've seen things like AI-generated newscasters, social media accounts that use AI-generated profile pictures to amplify, again, like immigration, abortion, drug use, kind of social issues that sort of press on division. I guess I would just say, like, it's a couple of things. One is we also saw these actors using, substantially less sophisticated techniques. And I think there's reason to believe, my personal view, I think there's reason to believe why, for adversaries, why you might actually avoid the use of AI, or at least when we talk about like the deep fake, less here talking about sort of like text-based influence operations. But, if the deception happens sort of in a way that doesn't leave a technical signature that gives defenders a hook, it sort of, again, complicates the picture for defenders. So I don't know that will hold, but you could imagine that might be the case. And so just using not all content, I guess I'm just offering like a little bit of a caveat here that, you can use far less sophisticated techniques. And you can also use AI to sort of manipulate media short of like wholly generating or creating it.
Yeah, exactly. Like something just decontextualized, like a sound clip, a sound
Yeah.
bite. Yeah, exactly. And maybe Ben, from where you're sitting at OpenAI, what kind of attacker trends are you seeing emerge right now? And also curious, I guess, for everyone here, how does your team actually kind of go about studying these influence operations?
So I'll take the second question first. Our job on intelligence and investigations is to try and work out how are different kinds of threat actors going to try and use AI, and then try and get ahead of them, so that when they do try, we find them, we disrupt them, we think of all the different possible ways that we can make their lives hard. So if they're using ChatGPT accounts, we'll ban the accounts, we'll publicly report on what they've been doing, we will inform the defender community, here's what we've seen. This is work which has been going on at OpenAI for at least a couple of years now, but it kind of, it flows from all the work that's been done in the open source community and at different platforms for the last probably 10 years by now. I've been doing this work for over a decade, which is frankly terrifying. And what we're really looking for is that evidence that threat actors are using AI in some way to try and get better at their covert influence operations. When we're talking about this, it's really important to remember, if you're looking at influence operations, if you're looking at scams, if you're looking at social engineering, it's always about people. I'm actually a medievalist by background. That's what I did at college. I am not a techie. But it turns out that actually, when you're thinking about influence ops or scams, there's a human operator at one end and there's a human target at the other, and everything in between, all the technology is just the medium. It's very easy to get distracted by the shiny medium, but actually operator and human on each end And what we've seen is the use of AI has primarily been an extension of known operations or known behaviors which existed in the pre-AI world. They're just trying to avoid some of the mistakes. The single greatest power in the galaxy is human error. If you have a human operator, they're going to slip up at some point. And so a lot of what we've seen in the use of AI has actually been from either existing operations or new operations, which are maybe sort of copycats of old activity, just trying to use AI to avoid some of the old mistakes and sometimes making new mistakes as a result, which I'll get onto in a second. For example, there's a Chinese operation known as spamouflage, which full disclosure, I actually named and discovered back in 2019. So apologies for giving it a name that nobody can spell. Spamouflage is notorious for massively posting on Facebook and X or Twitter and YouTube, Medium, Reddit, across the whole internet, appallingly badly written English language articles. They're so bad, they're hilarious. I remember one video they ran where the headline was, the tide of American democracy can no longer sustain the boat of presidential rule.
Whatever that
Very
means.
profound when you think. Last year, we detected and took down some ChatGPT accounts that were generating short tweets, which were then posted up by X accounts that were clearly spamouflage. If you looked through the history of the account, and you went back far enough, you found some of these rubbish, badly written tweets, and then they switched to doing English language content. And it was pretty clearly some operator was thinking, yeah, we keep on getting called out for being bad at English. Maybe if we use a large language model, it'll avoid the mistakes. What was interesting is that you look at those Twitter accounts, and they'd have like a few days when they're using AI content. And then they go back to the old-fashioned stuff again. And in terms of number of likes, retweets, shares, comments, it was zero either way. So they're clearly, they've identified a problem that they have, and they're using AI to solve that problem. But maybe that's not the problem that's actually stopping them getting viral impact in the first place. Or another example, spoiler alert, we are publishing a threat report later this week, detailing some of the more recent operations and takedowns that we've done. One of them is a takedown of recidivist activity, so repeat activity, by a Chinese operation that Meta originally disrupted and exposed back in mid-2022, which was, among other things, running fake accounts that were posed as Americans on both sides of the partisan divide. And in the Meta public report at the time, when they reported on this takedown, they said one of the curious things about this operation was they were posing as Americans, but they were always posting on Beijing daylight hours, which is 12 hours out from where they ought to be. So they were posing as Floridians, people from Florida, at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I haven't been to Florida, but I suspect even in Florida, people sleep in the middle of the night. The recidivist activity we took down was generally doing much the same kind of thing, generating short partisan comments on both sides of the aisle. We identified them being posted on social media by accounts posing as Americans. But the other thing this operation was doing was just occasionally asking ChatGPT, what's the best time of day to post on social media to get American audiences? Now, I can't prove that the operators read the Meta report and thought, oopsie, yeah, maybe posting in the middle of the night for Americans isn't the best idea.
Yeah.
But you do see that's the kind of evolution that we are seeing. But the fascinating thing is, and this comes back to the point of it's human on human, the use of AI has also led to a whole new fascinating range of mistakes. There's a really fun thing you can do just to sort of analyze this field a bit. If you set up a Google alert for daily hits on phrases like, as an AI language model, or sure, here's a comment on, or here's a better way of expressing this, every day you will find, frankly, sloppy social media managers who've clearly automated stuff and then posted it. One of the operations that we discovered and took down earlier last year was a previously unknown Russian operation active on Telegram that we called Bad Grammar. It was posing as Americans on both sides of the spectrum. It was generating content in authentic American dialect. So, you pose as somebody from Texas or from the Bronx or from Minnesota, wherever. And they had a bunch of fake personas. And I'm guessing that either the operators didn't speak any English or didn't bother proofreading, because I actually have and treasure a screenshot of a post that they published on Telegram. Sure, I'm sorry, but as an AI language model, I cannot get into the persona of Ethan Goldstein, a 57-year-old Jew, because authenticity is important. They published it, and we published the screenshot. And that is the kind of thing where, at the end of the day, the technology is the medium. but it's always human on human. And so far, we're seeing this evolution. There's a continuity in the sort of the overall behavior, and there is still continuity in the human predilection to make mistakes.
Exactly, and I think we often talk about the kind of content of influence operations, but what gives it that kind of significance is the faked engagement, so to say. What are you seeing, Nathan, kind of in terms of maybe astroturfing and what people are doing to kind of generate the illusion of grassroots support?
Yeah, I mean, this has been a focus of our concern because if you look at Chinese military writings, this is absolutely kind of a top TTV. This is something they're very interested in doing, right? So again, this goes back to both kind of one of their core objectives. So psychological warfare is usually targeted at national leadership or military troops. Public opinion warfare, which again has been kind of subsumed in the new cognitive domain operations, is broader, more broader society. And so obviously, to be able to generate kind of the artificial sense of a consensus in a society on any given topic is a very desirable ability, right? And so they definitely talk about that, and I think this is reflected in some of the reporting that Ben and Jess were talking about. The ability, seeking, playing around with, kind of picking sides, picking topics. This also fits well with kind of broader Chinese intents to play a little bit less in social divisions, but more big picture, lay these big picture narratives about China's rise, about Taiwan. I think there's some evidence that they've adopted some Russian tactics, but not all of them. And so I think it's definitely a key part. I think also, we usually have looked at Taiwan as kind of the early case study for evolving Chinese tactics. And so this, again, is something we see quite often in Taiwan.
Interesting. And I think, Jessica, you kind of talked a bit about attribution kind of changing. Is it kind of more plausible now, like more plausible deniability now, or more easily replicated tactics, or things becoming harder to parse?
Yeah, I mean, I think just as our, defenders evolve, the
Yeah.
threat actors evolve, and then we evolve in response, right? And I think one of the trends that we see is just an ever greater effort to hide their hand. That's ultimately sort of the name of the game. So whether by using, trying to disguise influence operations as authentic advocacy by working through authentic domestic voices, this can be witting or unwitting, is sort of like one of the key approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess, you both kind of spoke about this blend that people are using of AI and kind of more traditional tactics. Do you want to speak to kind of that sense of it being not necessarily a revolution, but kind of an evolution and how you're seeing the kind of AI influence operations?
Sure. I mean, like ultimately, the goal here, as like Ben pointed out, is to shape the sort of popular political attitudes of of another population. And a key way to do that is to assume the identity of somebody else. And so these are all different, sort of approaches and ways to do that. I guess just one thing that Nathan said was interesting to me, drawing on like the sort of, I think, differences between Russia and China's approach. Like Russia is like a security apparatus, sort of operating as a state, has a long history of conducting these kinds of campaigns. It is very good at reading the societies that it targets, and it, tends to use these kinds of more sophisticated, like information laundering techniques. Many of the, important campaigns that you've uncovered, speak to the sort of effort to sort of use multiple, accounts and platforms to try to, make a particular view appear to be both authentic and widespread. Beijing, it's sort of a party state kind of operating as a state. It is actually quite bad at reading the societies that it targets. And so I think it's a key sort of limiting factor of its influence campaigns. And also, to your point, like it's very hard to create the impression of sort of mass popular appeal on social media platforms that you ban at home. I mean, I think that's kind of a core sort of frustration that the CCP has faced.
Yeah, so when you read Chinese military writings, right, they will bemoan, self-critique that they're bad at foreign languages and bad at cross-cultural understanding. Right? So theoretically, AI, LM should be able to help you do both, right? I think, Ben, what you were saying a little bit was that there's evidence that they are using LMs to, get better at foreign languages, right? And that's something that's pretty straightforward. Actually, Google Translate's already pretty great, right? You don't have to go to ChatGPT to do that, but you can. The second question is cross-cultural understanding, which again, theoretically, it's pretty straightforward to use an LM to, posit being a Floridian and give me some things, some sports teams that somebody in Florida might like. Should I like the Yankees or the Marlins, the Buccaneers or the Seahawks, right? I mean, that's kind of a straightforward answer. You don't have to have actually lived in the States to have, ChatGPT or Llama tell you, statistically what is the clear answer there. But one of the other challenges being a party state is that there is propaganda lines that are acceptable to say and not acceptable to say. And so, again, this is where the human aspect really comes into play. Yes, like the broader, Chinese state has clear policy objectives, but there are also like humans operating these things that eventually want to get promoted and have a pay raise and have more money to spend on whatever they want, right? And so, like, what I like to posit is, if you imagine one of these spamiflage guys was chatting with ChatGPT and said, ChatGPT, give me a list of the top 3, arguments to convince Americans that China is rising, America is declining, and they shouldn't care about Taiwan. If, for whatever reason, the output was first argument, best argument to win over Americans is Xi Jinping is stupid, fat, ugly, and looks like Winnie the Pooh, right? If that was the answer, right, could somebody from Spamiflage copy paste that and put that in, and then 6 months later go back in his performance review and say, hey, boss, look what I did. My #1 tweet was that Xi Jinping is fat, stupid, ugly, and looks like Winnie the Pooh, right? Not how you get promoted in the Spamiflage club, right? And so there are actual like human organizational constraints on the ability of these actors even to use what is technologically optimal or possible, right? And again, I think from an open source perspective, it's really difficult to identify those kind of moments and say like, oh, look, Bobby had this great thing, but he decided not to use it because it wasn't aligned with the propaganda lines of the day. That's a challenge for us sitting here. But I think, we can pretty easily kind of back into the theory of there are challenges and there are reasons why the potential for this technology could be dramatic. But there are also some real human constraints that I think we're clearly seeing, right, limit that. And it's just a useful point.
You want to jump in, Ben?
And in fact, one of the really interesting things we've seen, and I think this is probably, it's certainly one of the most common approaches we've seen, if not the most common approach in influence operations globally, is faking engagement. There's a pattern you'll see. For example, we exposed an operation in February that originated, a commercial company, to your point, originating in the UAE and Ghana, targeting the Ghanaian presidential election. And it's a very classic kind of structure of an influence operation. It created a website posing as a youth organization. It then used ChatGPT to generate articles for the website. It set up a whole load of fake accounts across social media. For example, on Instagram, it would use ChatGPT to generate Instagram posts. And then it would ask the model to generate a batch of 30 comments for that Instagram post. And it would do that repeatedly. And when you looked at, we identified the Instagram account and we looked at it, and every single comment, every single post that it made had between 30 and 32 comments on it, of which 30 had been generated using ChatGPT. So your average actual engagement from human beings is from 0 to 2. It's a really, really common pattern. We've seen Chinese operations do the same thing, where they'll run a video, let's say, on a social media platform, and then like generate me 200 comments. And you look at the actual video, it's got 199 comments on it. It's all fake. And the really big question, to the sort of how do you get promotion in the Spamiflage club, they're clearly kidding somebody, but are they trying to convince the internet that this is a really popular video? Or are they trying to convince the guy who's paying the bills? It's like, look, boss, we got 32 comments on every single post. We got 200 comments on every single post. Don't tell him that we generated them all ourselves. And it seems absurd, but that is certainly one of the most common approaches I have seen for covert influence operations across the board and around the world. It's not the creation of that upfront content. It's the creation of all the comments to make it look like somebody's actually paying attention. That's a huge part of the sort of the spectrum of what we see, which says something about the inability to actually get traction. If you're having to fake it, it's because you're not making it.
Might I take this down a little bit more nefarious rabbit hole?
Of course.
So everything my colleagues have said is spot on. And I think where we are right now is so much of AI is evolutionary that the actual revolutionary component has not turned yet, but it progresses quickly. So let me just play a scenario with you, something that we've based upon net assessment and wargaming that I think is far more, at very, very least capricious, if not very nefarious. AI as an influence tool. Well, my colleagues have spoken to this in great detail, and they're absolutely correct. but change the extent of the influence. If one of the things that we can do through AI, and one of the things we can do through psychological and perhaps media engagement, is to understand the cognitive dimensionality of our peer competitor cum adversaries, which interestingly, both our trans-Pacific and our transatlantic peer competitor have dedicated programs to doing, some better than others. If we understand what our peer competitor or their peer competitor views as a profound enough threat, we can then generate dread. And dread is a profound human emotion. And if we can do this in a way that is reproducible on multiple levels of veridicality, in other words, if we have enough data, big data, that we can assemble utilizing AI programs that create what appears to be a reality, and that reality is perhaps a disease state, a highly infectious disease state, that perhaps doesn't infect humans, but does infect crops, pets, livestock, and we propagate that information, initially discreetly, but do that in such a way that has high cognitive resonance within our receptive audience, what you then get is something called cognitive contagion. And the effect of cognitive contagion when it comes to apparent threats that are recognized psychologically within a collective, the dread that it evokes, and the ability for that to then engage two factors that are critical. One is cognitive mobility. In other words, I need to change the way I think. And the other is actual physical mobility. In other words, I need to get out of here. I need to move. We need to do something about this. And what those particular types of mobilities incur is resource demand. So one of the ways that our peer competitor is looking to utilize AI is to utilize that in such a way as to gain insight to collective and individual cognitive patterns, to be able to understand key concepts and foci of what threats represent highest dread in given collectives and communities, and then to utilize semi-autonomous AI without the human bias, because as you've heard, our peer competitors are somewhat aware that their psychological precept is different than our psychological precept. But to then generate these cognitive constructs, to create these threat and dread narratives that are infiltrative to produce this type of cognitive contagion. A few years back, we modeled this in a cognitive warfare war game. We crashed the public health system in 43 days. There was no real disease. There was no virus. Nothing actually got sick. The only thing that was viral was the information and the propagation of that information and its fractal diversity within various nodes and networks of that system to be able to create the level of mobility, unrest, discontinuity, and therefore deterrence with regard to individuals' capability and collective capability, which then crashed the system. So when we think of AI, we have to think of it not only necessarily as this type of a tool for information, but to also be weaponized across those other domains of asymmetrical unconventional warfare, the biological, the chemical, etc., that may in fact be leverageable. And in those domains, the idea of inducing threat, artificial threat, non-veridical threat, but producing real dread and the manifest effects that it occurs in collectives is another domain of the cognitive battlescape that we are very aware of. Ma'am.
Absolutely. I think that's actually the perfect kind of segue to a big fear people have with generative AI, and that's the possibility of AI to consolidate vast amounts of like personal information and craft very unique social media messages and media that are incredibly persuasive because they're built on a personalized user profile. So even if it is kind of hypothetical now, maybe we can get into some of the different angles of the things you found, Ben, maybe with the sentiment analysis and monitoring social media, peer review.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, two pieces to it. In terms of the fear factor, there's a wonderful Harry Potter quote. Sorry, I'm the generation who loves quoting Harry Potter. Fear of a name increases fear of the thing itself. The more we talk about the fear without evidence, the more there is the risk that the fear itself will expand. We've been publishing threat reports for over a year now where we're actually setting out, here's the stuff we saw, and sure, here are the clever things that the adversaries did. Here are the bits where they actually they posted on Telegram as an AI language model. I can't be Ethan Goldstein. and having that evidence out there and teaching people to understand here's how you recognize this stuff has always been crucial. I was lucky enough that back in 2019, I led the research team that investigated the first large-scale covert influence operation on social media that mainly used AI-generated profile pictures. Now, this is, for those of you who are cognoscenti, this is GAN faces, right? So this is sort of 6-7 years ago. And when we started doing this investigation, we were frankly really scared because one of the ways to identify fake social media profiles had always been reverse searching. You can right click, you search it on Google, whack, there you go, where's where it's stolen from. And we couldn't do that anymore. And so for a few days as we were digging into this stuff, we were thinking, this is actually a game changer. And then we started realizing that these profile pictures were so distinctive that they leapt off the page at you. Anybody on that team who worked that stuff 7 or 8 years ago, you can show them a photo that big, and if it's GAN generated, they will tell you that it is GAN generated because we've seen so many of them. And we realized that there were ways to identify exactly how you could spot and prove that those were GAN generated profile pictures. And so what had been that scary moment where we were thinking, flip, this is a good way for the threat actors to hide, turned into a really good way for them to get caught. And still there are investigators out there who will find the kind of fake faces. So that's an example of it's the unknown that creates the fear, and the more we can put the evidence down there of here what we're actually seeing, the more we can kind of mitigate that alarm. In terms of analysis, there was a really interesting operation that we detected and disrupted. We reported on in February this year, which is an operation that we call peer review. This was an operation which was using ChatGPT, doing various kind of fairly classic Chinese influence op generations. But they were also using ChatGPT to polish and edit sales pitches. So as the investigators, we have the sales pitch. What's the sales pitch for? It's an AI-powered large-scale social media listening tool. According to the sales pitches, what this would do would ingest information from various different social media platforms, which I assume they were scraping, and then search for topics of interest to the CCP, like Uyghurs, human rights, protests against China, all this kind of thing. And then they would analyze them, do sort of, yes, positive or negative sentiment. And again, according to the sales pitch, the operators would then pass this information on to the Chinese authorities to take appropriate action. From our point of view as the investigators at ChatGPT, what we see is the sales pitch. But we see a sales pitch for an AI-powered social media listening tool. We think, yeah, we'd better go looking for that.
Yeah.
And so we did a sort of full-on investigation. Can we find evidence of this actually using our models? And we couldn't. But what we found was another ChatGPT account clearly associated with the first one, which was modifying and debugging code, which was designed to run an AI-powered social media listening tool with exactly the same brand name, which they were going to be running off Meta's Llama 3.8 open source model. Now, because of where we are sitting, we can't prove were they actually doing that. All we see is the ChatGPT activity. But that's where you see this really interesting intersect between different types of activities, social media, different sorts of AI. And to Nathan's earlier point about the Spamophage Club, the other thing this operator was doing was basically uploading bullet points of here's all the cool stuff I've done this year. Please turn it into a review for my manager, which is why we're calling this operation peer review. So even there, when you're right up at the kind of cutting edge of all the different sorts of AI, you've always got the human aspect.
Always got that human aspect. Nathan, does that kind of coincide with the PLA view of big data, maybe?
Absolutely. I mean, I think as part of the PLA evolution toward intelligence warfare, data and leveraging big data is fundamentally a big part of that. I could drown you in Chinese military articles about the beauty of big data for political work, which is kind of their even bigger catch-all for what we're talking about here. They absolutely think of it as a key tool, both for, tailoring contents for even individuals, right? They talk about precision cognitive attacks, but also just trolling through and better understanding, kind of societal topics and other things. I think from a PLA point of view, social media has provided them targeted delivery systems, right? It's very easy to tweak. I want to put this here, here, and here. And then AI has given them really the ability to tailor the content to be delivered. And so it's the two of them together that really provide, in their perspective, that kind of key change or key improvement. they have always wanted data. If you actually go back and read 10 plus 15 years ago, there was a series of articles from the Chinese military's kind of key psychological warfare influence operation unit called Base 311 that was actually writing about their efforts against Taiwan. And what you read is that they were talking about the radio era. They say, oh, it was so hard to get feedback back then because we'd broadcast these radio signals. The only way we would know if it was good is if somebody would write us a letter. Insane, right? Like from Taiwan, write them a letter back. But then, we had TV, we had the internet, somebody could comment on a blog, whatever. But social media, instantaneous, high quality feedback. What's my engagement? How many likes do I have, right? And so for them, all that kind of data, they're obsessed. They want all of it, right? And so it's a very natural evolution for them to kind of take both within their military theory, but more practically as well. This is the vision. I think the key question is, how well are they actually leveraging the data for the ends they want, right? You can also see Chinese military authors complain about not getting the cool data. They're like, oh, other departments don't share the data, right? You're like,
Bureaucracy.
bureaucracy, it's a terrible thing. And so, I think, again, it's very difficult, sitting here to really understand the nuances of how well, for example, all the data that China has hacked from America and everywhere else could, in a perfect world for, the Chinese state, right? Put it all together in a big Google Drive, mix it all up, and like you would have, amazing portraits of many individual Americans, right? I'm going to wager it's probably not that easy to actually have everybody play nice together in China. And so again, there are many ways you can paint a dire picture of it, but I think there are many human organizational impediments that are probably, for at least the foreseeable future, really going to challenge threat actors using this to the fullest extent.
Absolutely. And Jessica, do you want to jump in about this?
Sure. I mean, I would agree with that, right? I mean, Beijing is sitting on a lot of data, but the real question is to what extent is that data integrated? If they are able to use it to make influence operations, more personalized and more persuasive and harder to detect, that could be consequential, especially, for an adversary like China, which has historically not been particularly good at this.
Exactly. Maybe just to wrap us up, James, does this all coincide with your kind of idea of neurointelligence?
Yeah, a bit. So a few years ago, now a decade ago, my God, I'm getting old. A colleague of mine named Dr. Rachel Wirtzman and I were tasked with sort of looking at how these new trends in big data, AI, machine learning, and human-machine interfacing had some influence on the intelligence community in terms of how we could gather intelligence, perhaps so we could optimize the performance of intelligence operators, and also in some cases optimize the capability and assetability of intelligence assets. In other words, if we can assess certain things a particular way, could we access them to affect them in particular ways on both sides of the intelligence equation? So what we were really looking at is not only signals intelligence, which is so much of the discussion you've heard here, but also communications intelligence, also a large part of the conversation we've had today. But one of the things that came up over and over again, specifically as Ben mentioned, is that there are humans involved in the calculus. And those targets, in other words, the share and stakeholders of all of these machinations of different types of technology and techniques are humans, humans on the effector side and humans on the essentially recipient side. So the question then becomes, how can these technologies be leveraged in such a way to be able to maximize signal intelligence, communications intelligence with human intelligence? And this is where AI really began to play a role with regard to big data. The more data you have about individuals as those individuals relate and engage in their collectives and ecologies, the more you know about them, what makes them tick. Various patterns emerge, and there are large data, big data engines, one of them being Atra Avastera, that is capable of both Gnostic and agnostic pattern generation. In other words, data go in, and then on the other side, what these types of data engines do, utilizing various forms of machine learning, is create patterns. And you can either say, we'd like to look at patterns in these domains, or what patterns are there. Well, we here in the United States and among our technological and scientific allies recognize the benefit of this, as do our international peer competitors, scientifically, technologically, bioeconomically, economically, and certainly militarily and geopolitically. And so one of the things that we're now beginning to see is exactly this idea of precision engagement with regard to being able to get intel about various human targets individually and collectively, either high priority targets as individuals or groups that may be highly prioritized as individuals. What are their needs? What are their likes? What are their patterns? What are their spends? What are their vulnerabilities? Psychosocial vulnerabilities. And how can those be not only assessed utilizing big data and AI, but accessed in the cognitive space, but very often in the physical space as well. But then we must go one step further, and we have to recognize the interface between AI, big data, and human-machine interfacing. Now, clearly, I'm a neuroscientist, and one of the areas for us that represents the bleeding cutting edge is the yoking of human cognitive capability to the cognitive capabilities and machinations of these types of techniques and technologies and tools. How then can we allow this reciprocal engagement whereby the human operator optimizes what the machine system is capable of doing, and the machine system is able of optimizing what the human operator is doing in a reciprocal, complementary, real-time way? This is the domain of neurological and neurocognitive intel. And we don't have time to get down into the weeds of how these things work. And for those of you who are interested, come see me later. But this is not something that is now unique to us any longer here in the United States or among our international allies. It was one of the foci of the NATO report on cognitive warfare that I had the pleasure and privilege of co-authoring with my colleague, Franz de Cluzel. But one of the things we're seeing, particularly among our Trans-Pacific peer competitors, is the engagement of this triad of AI and big data, the cyber data sciences, the biosciences, and the human performance and intelligence sciences to be able to link technologies to bring those together into an optimized triune. So this now is becoming a new area of not only interest, but certainly application that we're paying more attention to, and what these interfaces would portend, entail, and perhaps obtain, and how to be one step ahead of what our international competitors are doing, in part because certain ethical constraints that they lack within their cultural, political, and philosophical system may enable them to be somewhat more adroit in experimentation and translation that we may be constrained in.
Yeah, and that's the perfect segue for my next question, maybe for Nathan, maybe for Ben. Why are these people using like kind of the Western LLMs when they know there's people like you guys on the other side? Is it because they're that much better? Like they don't have their own maybe like party sanctioned chat GPT, or what are your thoughts there?
It's a really good
Convenience?
question.
Yeah.
I can only speculate, and I try not to speculate. But you could imagine a scenario in which if you are trying to target Western linguistic tropes and Western cultural tropes, and particularly in a world where, you know, if to Nathan's point, you probably can't get away as a spamouflage operator with comparing Xi Jinping with Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah.
I could imagine a world in which you probably wouldn't want to be using a Chinese developed LLM to do that either. But ultimately, we don't know. One of the fascinating things in this job has been to see this kind of activity coming from what we assess as likely originating in China, and the use of ChatGPT, both for personal and, let's think of it as, work activities. You know, for example, the guy who is both generating social media comments for what looks like a covert influence operation and generating his performance review, or one we found last year where, again, part of Spamouflage was generating short comments that went out on Twitter. It was being used to debug code for a particular website that was being used to dox dissidents. And it was also being used to craft essays which had a strong resemblance to CCP internal exams. And so why is the operator doing that? We genuinely do not have the evidence which would prove it, but we see that that is happening. And as investigators, our job is to find it, identify it, disrupt it in every possible way we can.
So I would just add, I think it's important to note that there's a huge selection bias, right? That, you know, Ben, your job is to monitor OpenAI, ChatGPT. And so if there was somebody's job who was to monitor Llama, maybe they would have a different answer. But again, also the difference is that somebody actually go on OpenAI system. And so you own that when they come on your platform, right? Llama is open source released. And so actually, as soon as I download it, nobody else, you know, can know or needs to know about what I'm using it for. And so there's an inherent asymmetry of it. You know, when I'm talking about Chinese military interest and use, you know, fundamentally I'm basing it on openly available Chinese military writings. And so I'm relying on a Chinese military researcher acknowledging somewhere, somehow, oh, I'm using this, right? What you do see is that they definitely talk about using llama a lot, right? Again, that's what you've already been talking about. It, you know, I haven't done a comprehensive survey of all the different models available. I think it'd be very interesting for someone to do. You know, I would imagine that there absolutely have to be, you know, Spamiflage or other, you know, Chinese actors who are using Chinese LLMs, right? DeepSeek would seem to be the one. Obviously, there, you know, many others in China. You could also imagine, you know, the PLA or the parts of the Chinese government could be developing their own tailored or fine-tuned to this, right? So I think there's an inherent selection bias, but I do find it quite fascinating, the phenomenon that they're going on something they've already been outed using and is like inherently a known as monitored Western platform.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it just seems dumb. But, you know, one possibility is that they think it's good, right? Which I guess is something of a compliment. That like, you know, they're like, oh, well, you know, DeepSeek is Chinese made, llamas, you know, put out but not constantly updated. Like, you know, this is just the best. I want the best for my job. You know, these may not be the smartest people in the world, right? So maybe that's kind of the level of thought. But I do think it's interesting. Obviously, it'll be interesting to see if you continue finding these actors using it. The fact that you've been writing reports for a year and a half already and they're still using it suggests maybe they're just going to keep using it. You have job security for a while using it. You know, but I think again, to me, it gets to the human aspect. Like that's not really a logical choice, and
Right.
so these are you know humans doing this, and we should give them some opportunity to be dumb and stupid.
Might I add something to that? Yes, absolutely. But I think we also have to recognize they might be stupid like a fox. The reason I tell you this is that there are increasing incidences, particularly in the military space, of what's called false flagging. In other words, a peer competitor, adversary planting a flag to make them look incredibly stupid. And then circling that flag and doing the happy dance, and you go, well, look how stupid they are. That's where you're looking. You're not looking over here. What are the salient points that allow the peer competitor, the adversary, to look at that flag and then create that impression of saying, oh yes, look how stupid they are. This is called a fog of engagement. So while I totally agree with my colleagues, one of the things you have to be equally at least alert for, as Ben alluded to earlier, is the fact that we have to be very, very well informed and not just qualify what the potential risks are. In other words, it may be this, but really quantify how much of a risk is it. Ergo, what my colleagues are doing for a living, but also be aware of the risk of false flagging. We like to sit back and go, oh, aren't we smart and they're stupid? And then the fox gets your chicken. Back over to you.
Perfect.
I would just say, like, this is perception hacking, right? Sort of leveraging our expectation that manipulation might happen to increase our sense that it is happening, which is sort of ultimately, right, especially like in an election context, if the goal is to, undermine confidence in the outcome or in the process, or our democratic institutions more broadly, the sort of fear that it might have happened is as corrosive. You don't have to actually change a single vote to create the impression that you might have done it, and the impression alone is just as damaging. So it's something we care a great deal about, and I think, we also talk about the liar's dividend, right? Once we live in a world in which we can no longer trust that which we see with our own eyes, does this, first of all, there's an advantage that rebounds to those who are willing to lie, right? To hold up a truthful video and say, like, that's not me. But also, it increases skepticism. I would say, like, there's healthy skepticism is healthy, but nihilism about the existence of objective truth is not. It's actually quite corrosive, to democratic societies, which depend on the idea that the truth is knowable and citizens can discern it and use it to govern themselves. And I think this is sort of a key asymmetry that our adversaries exploit because authoritarian governments and they no such need of a healthy information environment to thrive. In fact, as we've discussed, is probably the total opposite, right? They benefit from a world in which there's absolute skepticism about the existence of objective truth, and in which information is tightly held.
Perfect. I think that's actually the perfect shift towards defenders now, and what you mentioned, kind of this asymmetric competition. So I guess, what do you think we can do to kind of leverage our advantages here in the face of kind of these AI-fueled influence operations?
Yeah. Well, I guess broadly, I think we are engaged in a persistent asymmetric competition with authoritarian challengers, and it's happening, outside of traditional military domains. And information space, I think, is one of the places in which our adversaries have identified and leveraged some of the sharpest asymmetries. Obviously, I believe open information environments, confer tremendous advantages on democratic societies over the long run, but in the near term, they do create certain, vulnerabilities that the adversary exploits. And so, I guess I would argue that we have to resist the urge to respond in a tit for tat manner, because I think we ultimately do more harm to ourselves than our competitors when we do that, right? Because again, as I've said, like democracy depends on the idea that the truth is knowable. So what can we do? I think we should do what our adversaries have done, which is to sort of audit, where there are asymmetries that rebound to our advantage. I mean, another, I think, reason not to respond in a tit for tat kind of approach is because it prolongs the contest on the terrain that they have selected, which is terrain that's advantageous to them. So we should shift the terms, of the competition. So what are our, advantages? I think some of them are, in the information domain. Advocating, for open information, worldwide, it's the right thing to do, but it also puts adversaries on the back foot. Some of the kind of work that our government has done to expose the hidden hand of the foreign adversary so that American citizens can make their own determinations, about what it is that they're seeing, but they're doing it with the full knowledge of the, and context. But then we can also, leverage other advantages. So, things like our cyber capabilities. We took the IRA offline for a few days, quite famously, around the 2018 midterms. And there are other ways that our, government can use its cyber capabilities to, make it harder for our adversaries to do their work. We've also got a vast network of friends and partners, and we should be working with them, exchanging information and kind of standing shoulder to shoulder, I think, against a threat that engages both of us. Obviously, also like the centrality of our markets and our ability to use sanctions and other financial tools, and rule of law. I mean, I think one of the most consequential aspects of the last during the last presidential cycle, there was a DOJ indictment and affidavit. I mean, that put a lot of information in the public domain, and it leveraged our rule of law system, to go after those who break the law. So. That's kind of how I would see, an approach to pushing back and to resist the urge, not just to use our own influence operations, but also, to respond to whataboutism in kind, because again, so much of this stuff is whataboutism. We just talk about like kind of cognitive. You're the brain scientist, but like, if you're responding to the charge in a sort of whataboutist contention, like you are just again prolonging that conversation. So just like take it to 30,000 feet, right? Call out the tactic. I think those are sort of probably better approaches. And also, I think, the United States has tended to default to messages about human rights that, unfortunately, I think don't resonate or resonate only with, like, I don't know, I don't think they quite work. And so, I think also two things. One, we have some of the best content creators in the world and some of the most, like vast creative industry. And I think we should find creative ways to leverage some of that as we sort of pursue information competition. And the other is not to be afraid to talk about our own shortcomings. I mean, that is fundamentally what democratic societies can offer that authoritarian ones cannot. And so we just shouldn't be afraid to talk about the places where we do have, challenges that we can overcome. I think it's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness to do that.
Perfect. Ben, you've talked about AI for defenders before. Anything you want to bring to light?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts, and one to Jess's point. I mean, it's important to understand the environment that all this is happening in. And you're talking about content creators. So much of this activity happens on social media, and so many operations are exposed running fake accounts. I have lost count of the number of dozens of social media ops I've analyzed, disrupted over the years. Practically none of them actually managed to build any real audience. And one of the things to bear in mind is I'll tell you an anecdote which kind of illustrates this. A friend of mine has a daughter who's just about to graduate from a rather prestigious UK university. And according to this daughter, roughly half of her graduation class want to be influencers. I'm sure you're all terribly shocked. Social media are a world where you have millions of very young, dynamic, creative, artistic, engaged people with lots of real friends, all of whom are battling for attention. And you're trying to run a fake account which is going up against all of them. Social media are a really, really unforgiving environment. And so it's really important as we're thinking, as investigators, our job is to go and find the stuff on social media. So like 99% of what I look at on social media is the fake stuff because that's what I'm looking for. But that's not what the majority of social media activity is. And so it's really important, even before we talk about the AI for defenders, just to think through, there is a robustness in the online community which we should not underestimate, and that's all the real people out there who are competing. But in terms of AI for defenders, there's another Harry Potter misquote. You see, Prime Minister, we get to use magic too. We're the defenders. We get to use our own AI. I can't go into too much detail as to what we do because I don't want the bad guys to catch on yet. But we can use AI to supercharge our detection, to use it in triage, analysis. We use it all the way through the investigative stack. One of the reasons we manage to do as much as we do is because we're using the AI to help us. And there are plenty of AI models out there. Hey, ChatGPT is pretty good. But if you are in the defender community, think about the ways that you can use AI as well. And your usage will depend on what you're actually looking for. It's particularly useful if you're doing some kind of repetitive procedure that you do a lot, because generally, like typing in a single AI prompt, which is only going to use one time, it's questionable whether if you're never going to use it again, is it worth just like doing the job yourself? But if you're looking at a repetitive task, there's a really useful thought experiment that you can do, and this will sound silly, but it actually works. If you could choose any fictional detective in the world as your investigative assistant, which one would it be and why? If you think of Sherlock Holmes, you're probably looking at very specific physical clues that you need to bind together to work out what's been happening. If you are looking at Miss Marple, that is somebody who has infinite knowledge of all the other cases there have ever been, and you're comparing the case you found with one of those. If you're thinking of Hercule Poirot, you're thinking about the psychology of the individual. In which case you're looking at deep psychological understanding of the behavior that you're looking at. And that will help you to think, okay, if I were to start building a custom prompt, what am I actually getting it to do? And then you can start using that as your own sidekick. You can have Sherlock Holmes at your side, or Dr. Watson, if you prefer. And so AI is such a tool for the defenders as we work out, for each of us individually, what is the most useful use case.
Great, perfect. And maybe Nathan and then James before we wrap up for audience Q&A. Nathan, what do you think we need in terms of capacity building for defenders, institutional capabilities?
Sure. So I'll make a couple of brief points. Obviously, strongly agree with what everybody said so far. I mean, I think media literacy has been a core component. It continues to remain a core component. I think also, as well, more transparency, both from the platforms, but also from government. Historically, USG, ODNI has released a public report on foreign threats to U.S. elections, somewhere between a couple months and I guess, unfortunately, up to a year after the election. And so far, as a researcher, I'm still waiting for U.S. government to release a report about the 2024 elections. I'm very eager for that. It'd be wonderful to have that information public and be able to document, understand, and talk about, inform ourselves. What did China, Russia, and others do from, fundamentally the best in the business, right? Having the information is very important. I think also working with allies and partners, especially talk about China. Really, again, the key recipient of that is Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
So always encourage Taiwanese government to do more, to share more information. And I think the US government has a key role to play in supporting and facilitating that dialogue between Taiwan and other diplomatic partners they have. Then, lastly, I think also it could be, a call for folks in this room or people who are interested in this conversation to kind of join the research community. I think there's a lot of additional research that can be done, that should be done. Doesn't matter whether the topic is in vogue these days or not. I think fundamentally it's an important thing that will remain an issue. And so there's definitely an opportunity for additional research.
Are you calling Jessica out there for not releasing reports? Or?
I didn't say that. I didn't say that.
Okay, and then, okay, well, James, to wrap up with you, maybe we can talk about a kind of cognitive defensive posture.
Sure. So as you guys could probably tell, this is not a speech impediment. I was born in New York City, and you just can't get rid of this accent. When I was a little kid, and I haven't been back to the city in years, when I was a little kid, there was a clothes store called Sims. And the owner and his daughter would come on TV, and they had a sort of a buzz phrase that they would use. And I'll translate that to you, and I think this is very important cognitively. They would say, at Sims, an educated consumer is our best customer. Translate to you. When it comes down to the capricious and nefarious use of AI, I think that an educated public becomes the best consumer of this type of information. Understanding what's happening, understanding what the real scientific and technological capabilities are and what they lack, where the limitations lie, becomes critically important, which obviously puts an incumbent responsibility upon those of us who teach, provide, and inform to be able to keep you ahead of that power curve, because fixity of purpose, being able to be ahead of this power curve, demands flexibility of method in application. We also need to recognize that this defending against involves not only disruption of what our peer competitors are trying to do and how they're trying to disrupt us, but also realistic deterrence. And that deterrence, I really do believe, begins with definition of what represents realities from non-realities, and from that definition, determination of what can be done, what should be done, and then realizing what we should do into those things we can. Over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, we covered a lot of ground today about how AI is reshaping, how AI is not reshaping influence, cognition, resilience. And now I'd love to bring you all into the conversation with a quick Q&A. So if you want to go up to the mic, state your question and maybe who it's for, if not the entire panel.
Thank you. My name is this on? Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yeah.
I'm Dr. Courtney Raj from the Center for Journalism and Liberty at Open Markets Institute. And didn't hear you guys talk about, you talked a lot about social media, but we know that people's user habits are changing. A lot more people are using chatbots. So one of the, I think, threats that we've seen in terms of cognitive warfare is, much better, is the pumping out of AI generated material into the public web, which is then used for training and RAG, and the grounding of these kind of chatbots and search engines. And there is research showing that that information is getting regurgitated into the models, particularly as quality information producers are increasingly putting their websites off limits to uncompensated, unlicensed scraping. So could you talk a little bit about that dynamic, and especially interested in Ben from OpenAI, since OpenAI has taken the position that text and data mining should be free use, for fair use, and not compensated. How will you mitigate against this type of threat, which we're already seeing manifesting, and the need to balance the continued provision of accurate, valid data, and given that those are interrelated in terms of how you get compensated for the creation of valid content?
Okay, just for expectation setting in the answer, I'm an investigator. My job is investigating threat actors. I have many colleagues here in the building whose job is far wider, but I can't speak to the broader strategic questions around compensation. That's not my role. In terms of the reporting that's been out there, it's really important to be careful here on exactly what the claims are. The reports that I have seen have been that there are a couple of operations, Russia-related, the John Mark Dougan network and the Pravda network, where the claim is that they have, and I quote, poisoned AI models. As far as I've been able to see from the research which has been going on, effectively what's been happening is that various different chat tools in their internet search function have returned finds from particular websites, and that's particularly its recent claims. Over the last few months, where training data tend to cut off, sort of a year and a half beforehand. So what we're looking at is really it's a question of the structure and the integrity of the information space, and if a particular threat actor is generating a very large number of pieces of content on different websites, effectively that's a new generation of search engine optimization going on. That's distinct from actually getting into the training data, which are generally very, very carefully curated. If it's showing up as a search result, what you're then asking is, if you're putting in a prompt which turns up that result, what are the other kinds of pieces of information out there that may be turning up instead? Are there publicly available sources? There was an interesting one a while back where there was a study of Russian language content, particularly where a lot of search results were turning up from Rossiyskaya Gazeta and the Russian Foreign Ministry. Part of the question is, what's the provision of Russian language content into that space, which would then actually sort of contest the information space that we're talking about? But ultimately, it's important to distinguish between what is a search result which is drawing from the internet as opposed to something which is sufficiently aged that it might have gone into training data. And I know from talking with my colleagues that training data are very, very carefully curated.
Maybe I can get somebody who's not from a company, because that does not ring true with the research that we've seen about how at least some of the underlying models are done. And I just think the broader, I'm interested in the broader tension that will exist as we see that the open internet is infused with all of this generative AI junk, which will then be incorporated both into training and RAG, but more of this dynamic between how we see these threats evolving in this space, in generative AI chats, searches, et cetera. Maybe Jessica.
Well, I was just going to say, I think this is a broad and longstanding phenomenon that predates even the AI era. I mean, some research that I did in a previous life before my time in government, showed just the surprising performance of state-backed propaganda in search results across a variety of platforms. I mean, we did a study of, Chinese state-backed outlets and their content related to Xinjiang and COVID, and I mean, they were dominating news results across platforms that many Americans use on a regular basis. And the issue there, it's not clear whether this is a tactic that the Chinese government is identified, or if it's just a byproduct of the fact that the New York Times wrote one story about the labs conspiracy theory in whatever August of that year, and then moved on because it has all kinds of imperatives that it has to meet, Russian state media can just hammer that narrative. Likewise, Chinese state media can hammer that narrative day after day after day after day after day, and they're creating vast contents. And that was true before they were able to leverage AI in that activity. I think one thing that's particularly interesting is, I think it should be possible to identify where these pieces are appearing, sort of across the internet. Basically, what's happening is, and this is again in a pre-AI era, when you were not sort of as readily able to use generative AI to create novel content each time. Even then, we were seeing these stories just republished, under different headlines or on different news sites that sort of appear to be generated by different, their links back to the original government were not transparent. And I think it should be possible to be able to do more to kind of highlight those links.
Perfect. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, probably one.
Okay, my name is Sabrina Elias. Thank you for the presentation, very insightful, and have us thinking a lot about how we're going to face the world. We have heard a lot today about outside threats to the US and how AI and different technologies are being used. Could I get your insights about threats that are in-house with individuals or small groups that have their own specific agendas and are targeting our democracy and our systems to implode our capabilities as a country and as individuals at the end?
I'll jump in first. You raise a very interesting issue. I mean, it's not endemic to AI, but certainly with many of these emerging technologies is that you essentially have the intersection of three market spaces. One is the obviously commercial market space and the way these things are being used broadly commercially. The second is the direct to consumer, where you then have to ask, well, who is the consumer? I mean, who is that individual and what sovereignty do they exist? And then what is their role? What are their intentions? And what are those manifest actions? And then three of the individuals is sort of the do-it-yourselfer who take those things that are extant and reverse engineer them. In each of those latter two, you also have the capability for the insertion of viable proxies and or non-state actors. And so one of the issues with any one of these emerging technologies, AI being no different, certainly we see that in the biotechnologies, chem, and even in some of the radionuclear technologies, is that individuals working within a sovereignty need to be overseen, in some cases regulated and governed, by whatever are going to be those forces of oversight, regulation, and enforcement within the sovereignty, from the local to the city to the state to the federal. And that then creates a slightly different picture. I mean, it moves then into Federal Bureau of Investigation, it moves into local law enforcement, and clearly it conjoins all the individuals and the resources that you see before you on the panel, but I think it does it in a slightly different way. Now it looks at the issue of national security as intra-national security in terms of what are the inherent risks within a sovereign infrastructure and its functions, and the vulnerability of its nodes and networks to various types of purloinment. For us, for those of us who work within the national defense space, one of the things we see as critical to that is not just an entirety of government approach, but a whole of nation approach that brings those resources to the fore to recognize the internality as well as externality of threat. Over to my colleagues.
Anyone want to answer? Can move on to the next question. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you. This was a great talk. I'm Dr. Ross Geddes, representing Geddes Neural Network Global Foundation. And my question for you, I'm a neurotrauma endocrinologist. And when I see AI fuels cognitive warfare, I wanted to hear your thoughts more about direct brain manipulation and that kind of warfare.
So without robbing too much of the time, that is sort of my sandbox. When we're talking about direct brain intervention or engagement, there are really two ways to do it. Number one is to actually put something into someone's brain. And there's a number of ways you can do that. You can utilize forms of directable energy, inclusive of utilizing these types of computational devices as a vector and resource for doing that. And we can talk about some of that offline. Some of that work obviously exists in a classified space. I cannot speak about it. In terms of what our peer competitors are doing, and then also what we need to do to remain both prepared and ahead of that. But then there's also the idea of manipulating information based upon some of the things we talked about earlier, understanding what it is that makes individuals and collectives, if you will, tick. As a traumatic end or clinical endocrinologist, you recognize that one of the things that any operator in this space is looking to do is to engage. I'm going to get a little medical with my colleague, is to engage the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in such a way that does two things. Number one, produces an acute phase response, and then secondarily produces a more chronic response, which is then far more disruptive with regard to vulnerability. The first may be an activating response. The second response prompts vulnerability. And this is where we then get into the idea of cognitive movement and mobility and manipulation. If you then couple that with something that is actually physical, in other words, some type of resource deprivation and or imposition, if you then heighten key factors that may be threatening like climate or disease or nutritional deprivation, you're going to augment that endocrinologic response in such a way that you're then going to get a neuromobilization response. You're engaging the neurocognitive space. Do our peer competitors recognize this, and is this actually a targetable enterprise of some of their both non-kinetic and kinetic engagements? Yes. If you'd like to speak about that a little bit more offline, I'll be happy to talk to you, sir. Thank you.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for your questions. Okay. Yeah, I think my panelists and my colleagues will be around all day. So if you have a question, feel free to find them after. Thank you.